It was a moist and cold night in Detroit, Michigan. Sabine Wren was relaxing on her couch, comfortably spread across the felt cushions, enjoying the embrace they simulated. Nothing brought her more comfort than relaxing on a frosty night with her most cherished game, Lego Star Wars: The Complete Saga. Even better, her favorite mission, Episode 4, Part 1, Secret Plans. She let out a contented sigh and smiled softly, for she was ready for an uninterrupted night of session of quality gaming time. She raised her Wii remote and began to select the game. Her left hand gently raised the nunchuck and swiveled the joystick, savoring the tactility of the controls. She bit her lip and began her journey once more. Sabine had reached her favorite part of the mission, where she takes control of her fan-favorite character, Rebel Friend.
God, I love this game,
she whispered to herself, but was interrupted by a strange rumbling sound outside of her home. Sabine stood up and looked out the window, but did not notice anything of consequence. She hastily returned to her seat on the sofa, returning to the game, before suddenly freezing. Something was off. Upon closer examination of her television screen, someone was staring back. Meeting her gaze was none other than Rebel Friend, his expressionless face taking up half the screen as she stared into the space towards Sabine as if he could see her. He raised a single hand, or claw rather. Sabine wasn't sure what it was called. Rebel Friend then moved it back and forth, almost waving at her. Sabine hesitantly raised her own hand, clenched in fear, and uneasily opened it, waving back. Rebel Friend continued to stare. Sabine's heart rate increased. She began to breathe stronger. What could he want from me? Why does he stare? She moved the joystick on her nunchuck. Rebel Friend only stared. His waving ceased, and he lowered his blocky arm. He then began to reach out to her.
This can't be real,
Sabine thought to herself. She tilted her head slightly and waited to see what he would do. His claw hit the motionless camera that Sabine looked through, and it kept moving. It kept moving. Sabine took a sharp breath as his arm passed all the way through, and his torso began to cross over into her world. A wave of momentary panic came over Sabine as she wondered what this otherworldly being could want from her. Rebel Friend stepped out of the TV and promptly shut off, closing the two in darkness and an eerie silence. Rebel Friend remained motionless, but the way he stared, it felt like a smile to Sabine. She unsurely smiled back at him, and he took this as an invitation. He approached Sabine with slow steps, approaching slightly faster with each step. Sabine held her breath as he drew closer. She could see the streetlights outside reflecting off his plastic body. He grew close enough to touch, and Sabine took another sharp breath as he stopped and loomed over her. She waited for what he would do next. Rebel Friend reached forward and grasped her arms with his silicone claws. The plastic on his skin startled Sabine, but then made her interested. She backed off slightly, but curiosity got the best of her. She leaned forward and closed her eyes, hoping he would return the favor. She leaned forward and shuddered as her lips hit cold plastic. She didn't know what she expected, but her disappointment was short-lived as he pulled her closer and kept her going. His plastic began to heat up as Sabine's warm lips embraced his unnatural flesh. A soft moan was elicited from Sabine's uneasy form. She felt so wrong, but had only dreamed of feeling the cold embrace of one so soft and pure. Oh my fucking God. They continued for a few moments, but Rebel Friend seemed to pull back. Sabine was momentarily heartbroken before Rebel Friend took his claw and stroked her hair as he nodded. Sabine began to understand. She nodded back and slid down to his waist. She unhooked the bottom half of Rebel Friend, and Rebel Friend swapped them for his other legs. Sabine readied herself as his block cock grew erect before her eyes. Sabine's eyes widened as she smirked. As she took his block cock in her hand and put it in her mouth, she let it go back and forth, moving her head with a rhythm he created, each bob giving both of them pleasure as the claw held back Sabine's hair, keeping it out of the way. Sabine tried to continue going for as long as she could, but Rebel Friend stopped her and stepped back. Sabine looked on with a sad face, wondering why Rebel Friend wasn't taking it any further. Rebel Friend took her face softly and leaned in as they continued to kiss passionately. Sabine wondered if this was as far as they'd go. As the thought crossed her mind, Rebel Friend moved his right claw down to her hips and gripped her thigh. He then began to turn her, and Sabine understood. She then removed her volleyball shorts, sliding them down to her ankles before kicking them off. She gets into low pose across the couch and readied herself mentally.
This is about to happen. Oh my binks.
As Rebel Friend straddled her back legs. Sabine readied herself. She knew Rebel Friend meant business. She knew it was coming, but she didn't know when, and she kept her face forward, ready for the start. She could feel his block hood start to rub against her backside. She closed her eyes and started to rock back and forth. Suddenly, she felt a sharp pain as 4 points rubbed against her edges. She gasped hard before feeling the pleasure. She moaned as Rebel Friend picked up some speed. Sabine gripped the blankets and held on for dear life. She could feel the corners of his throbbing cock sliding through her. She had trouble keeping her eyes open from the pleasure, but she caught glances around the room occasionally. At one moment she thought she saw green eyes and a tuft of purple air through the closet shutters, with a faint scent of homosexuality. But she dismissed the possibility.
God, I hope she never stops,
she thought to herself as he increased in speed. She had no care for anything else in the moment, except for Rebel Friend, his face remaining unchanged throughout the whole ordeal. Sabine's hair swung with each thrust of in and out. She cried in pleasure as Rebel Friend gripped her thick ass. Rebel Friend unleashed his load into Sabine, exploding like a million studs.
Oh well.
As her character dies in the game. She screams out in pleasure as he withdrew from her quivering cave, and her eyes rolled into the back of her head as she falls onto the couch exhausted. Rebel Friend took 7 steps back and nodded to Sabine as he switched outfits back to his regular attire. Sabine looked up pleadingly, hoping he would stay, but Rebel Friend just shook his head. It was time for him to go.
Well, will I ever see you again?
He only stared back, but a twinkle in his eyes spoke to her. It seemed to stay. I'll be back for you, sweet cheeks. I love you, nigga. End scene.